This is Freedom First, and I'm Jeffrey Tucker. Today I would like to talk to you about the Federal Reserve, which seems to be doing ever stranger things these days. I ran across a little press release from the Fed that said that they've been involved in preparing for climate change. They're running these exercises to try to see if they're ready for climate change and what they're going to do about it. Now, it's just crazy. I understand the Fed is involved in all matters of policy these days. But, my mind went back to, 1913, and I'm thinking about the founders of the Federal Reserve. They imagined that the Federal Reserve was going to put a stop to business cycles, put a stop to inflation, bring rationality and science to the conduct of monetary policy. It didn't happen. Immediately, but they were tasked with the job of funding the Great War and U.S. entry into it, which forestalled a diplomatic solution to a terrible conflict and destroyed Europe. All right, that was the Fed, and that ended up devastating American purchasing power in the 5 years following U.S. entry into the Great War, and then creating more and more business cycles, including the Great Depression and all the business cycles since. But, the idea that the founders of the Fed would have imagined that the Fed would, in the year 2024, be trying to prepare for a dramatic change in the weather, or the climate, as they say, and using their tools to do something about it would have seemed utterly preposterous. But those are the times in which we live. Climate change is the big fashionable thing. That's where the foundation money is. That's where the government money is. That's where all the university money is. So everybody's got a solution to climate change these days. Whether the whole problem is real or imagined, human caused, or whether there's anything we can do about it, either way, is not even a consideration. You're considered to be a crazy kook and nutty and unscientific if you even question it. So of course everybody just goes about their business, presuming that we face an existential threat from climate change. As you know very well, if you listen to NPR or watch CNN or read the New York Times, you know the score, you know how it works. Well, the Fed does too. So now the Fed is conducting tabletop exercises to prepare for climate change. Now, what is the Fed going to do about climate change? Well, if property values suddenly drop and there's what they call fire sales, the Fed will provide the liquidity and credit to bolster prices and fix things up. Or if suddenly homeowners have to flee and housing prices crash, the Fed's going to provide liquidity and patch up that community. Or if banks start to fail because they're having to pay out a lot of money, facing defaults, or if insurance companies are having to pay out a lot due to excess liabilities on the part of private industry, the Fed will be there to print the money and make the credit available. So are you starting to see the theme here? It's always the same. It's always the same with the Fed. Whatever the problem is, they're going to fix it by printing more money. That's for a reason. Because that's the only thing that the Federal Reserve does. It has one tool, has the ability to print money, to provide more credit and money to the system. It's an alchemist, and everybody loves the alchemist in town. Give me more money. Not a problem. We can just make it up here with our magic computer entries that buys government bonds that Congress spends. So they pretend to have it all under the control. Must we do this yet again? Yes, apparently so. The Fed has been making trouble for 110 years, and now it's preparing to do it all over again in the name of solving the latest fashionable existential threat. And this happens just 4 years after the Federal Reserve got involved in infectious disease control. And you know the score here. Starting in January of 2020, we started hearing about a virus from China. By February, people were starting to get a little bit more panicked. By the first week of March, the whole world seemed to be freaking out. And the Federal Reserve, around March 11th, March 12th, started lowering interest rates again, back down to zero, and embarked upon one of the great inflationary bouts in American history. At some point, the M2 money supply was increasing at 26 per annum. They ended up creating about $6 trillion over the COVID period, mostly involved in buying the bonds that the Treasury was issuing in response to Congress spending trillions of dollars in stimulus payments. The Fed is what made it possible. If the Fed hadn't been there, Congress couldn't have spent the money. If U.S. bonds weren't backed by the Treasury, they would be facing a market risk premium, same as state bonds all over the country. States don't have central banks, so they have to balance their budgets or float bonds that have to face a market test, and they're rated according to market standards, more or less. At least there's a default premium associated with them. That's not true for federal bonds because the Federal Reserve is the printing press that the government uses to bail itself out. Now, if the Fed hadn't done this in the middle of March, basically provided the liquidity necessary for the cockamamie plans and spending from Washington, the lockdowns would have stopped right away. States would have opened up because they would have faced massive fall in revenue, and the money would not have been there for stimulus payments to pay people not to work, sit at home, stay safe from the virus, and businesses closing, but receiving tens and hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government. All this was provided by the Federal Reserve. If the Fed didn't exist, lockdowns would not have happened. Now you might say that can't be true because lockdowns were happening all over the world. Well, true enough, but central banks were happening all over the world. Whether you look at China, Asia, the UK, Europe, even Latin America, every single central bank flew into action to provide all the necessary funds to make the lockdowns possible. They never would have happened otherwise. So we took what turned out to be a virus with a 99+% survival rate that we could have handled through normal therapeutics and normal public health measures like we've always used, and embarked on a global experiment in lockdown virus control that ended up destroying cultures and economies and education and demographics and demoralizing populations and making people sicker than ever and ruining hospital systems and government budgets and enabling whole governments all over the world to ignore their own civil liberties and laws and instead back censorship and interruptions in the freedom of travel and violations of religious liberties, since people couldn't go to church either, and devastating the freedom of association. In other words, the laws of 500 years, the aspirations for emancipation of humanity, the extension of human rights and human liberties, all got trashed and thrown out. It was all made possible, I will submit to you, solely because the Federal Reserve was there to provide the necessary liquidity to make the dreams of bureaucrats come true. If the Fed hadn't been there, they would have curbed their enthusiasm a little bit, a lot, and not done this. So here you see a great example about how the very existence of the Federal Reserve creates a moral hazard. It takes what might be problems and turns them into mega problems. Instead of incentivizing real solutions, it enables people to become their worst. It allows politicians, bureaucrats to become much worse than they otherwise would be, all because the printing press is there. So this is the danger with something like a central bank. It's like if you ever sent your kid off to college with a credit card and said, don't worry about the spending limits, right? You know what would happen. I don't care how well you raised them, you're going to be facing a problem. All right. Imagine that system 1 billion times or 10 billion times worse. That's what it's like when governments are given a credit card without limits by central banks around the world. So they tend to glom onto problems, real or imagined. And as you well know, after COVID sort of disappeared, the next thing that came along was climate change. We all have to solve the climate change problem. So now you have central banks jumping into the business of figuring out climate change too. Now, I went through the tabletop exercise and their report that they produced from the tabletop exercise and what they're going to do. And it's just filled with all the usual managerial, bureaucratic baloney. It's not really English. It's not really English sentences. It's somebody else. It's a strange managerial professional speak that sounds really fancy and credentialed and scientific and in control. And they know what they're doing. But the bottom line of the whole report is we are going to inflate the money supply. That's it. That's all they know how to do. It's a hammer and everything is a nail. That's the way the Fed works. And so climate change is their new nail. Now we might want to consider what the consequences of the previous big investment the Fed made, which was COVID. What were the consequences of that? Well, according to the official price data given to us by the Consumer Price Index, the dollar has lost about 20 cents of value over the last 4 years. All right, so do you believe that? Do you believe that your prices that you're paying for goods and services and insurance and everything else is up only 20%? I doubt it. Based on your experience, what would your estimates be? 30%? 50%? 75%? 100%? Or more? It depends on the product, right? Depends on the product. I can tell you at restaurants. And if you can even calculate the prices anymore, there's so many hidden fees. You get a theater ticket for $45 and there's an $8 processing fee. You go to the veterinarian and they're going to charge you an extra fee for throwing away the needle that went into the dog's vaccine. I mean, everything now comes with hidden fees you can hardly keep track of because the price pressures have become this hot potato that they're trying to hide everywhere. If you go down to your local bar and order a beer, you're probably going to have a beer delivery charge because the guy gave it to you, and you'd be lucky to avoid a glass cleaning charge at the end of it. You know, that's what it's become like. And I'm very sympathetic to private enterprise here. They're facing pricing pressures all over the place, and they're having to figure out ways to get more revenue from consumers. So they're doing their best, but it's annoying and creates the strong sense that everybody's trying to pillage you left and right. You used to think about your local merchants and your grocers and the bartender and your local symphony and so on, or the car dealer as your friends that were helping you get the products and services you want. Now you're starting to be suspicious. How come you're lying to me about prices? How come every time I use you, there's hidden fees associated with this? So if you can calculate all those hidden fees plus the shrinkflation and adjust the CPI for interest rate increases, an authentic representation of where rents are, because they don't do that. They do the owner's equivalent rent, which is not the same thing, and include health insurance costs in that, which they don't do. They use some cockamamie formula that makes health insurance costs go down the more health insurance you consume. That's a subject for another time. And reweight everything the way they did in the 80s instead of the way they started doing after the turn of the millennium. You can end up with a figure that is in fact closer to 30% or 50% or more. In other words, in the last 4 years, the dollar might have lost more purchasing power than it lost between 1978 and 1981. I can't say that for sure, but I think it's probably very close to that. And that was a devastating inflation. By 1985, we turned around and realized what had happened. American savings was completely gutted. The capital stock was gutted. It now became more common for households to have two sources of income rather than one. We called it women's liberation, but there was no more choice left. Most women with children were suddenly at work rather than at home. That was not because of a change in the culture. That was a change that was inspired and funded by the economic devastation of the inflation of the late 1970s, which was entirely made possible by the Federal Reserve. It's the same thing, once again, with COVID. The Federal Reserve has devastated American living standards and reduced the value of the dollar by between 20 and, let's just say, 75% in the last 5 years, and it's eating us alive with hidden fees, with shrinkflation, with outright price increases. None of us wanted this to happen. We're all still traumatized by it. We're experiencing sticker shock everywhere we go now. So this is an enormous, a huge failure of a system. We know what caused it. We know the inflation, $6 trillion and over the course of 2 years, a year and a half to 2 years, that watered down all the existing value of the prevailing money stock and caused vast inflation. And everybody knows this. And instead of apologizing and saying, you know, we made a lot of mistakes, institutionally, we're really not up to this job. We're pretending to do things we really can't do well. We're not going to do anything anymore. That's what would happen in a rational world if we cared about evidence, if we cared about science, if we cared about functional institutions and truth. But instead, we've got the Federal Reserve now embarking on a new adventure to save us from climate change. That's the way it works. We've got to have better systems that correct in light of failure. So many of our official institutions have failed, and everybody knows this, from medicine to science to government to media to technology. One of the top failures has been the Federal Reserve. We know this now. And yet, all these institutions and all the people who run them pretend as if they're still masters of the universe, and they're going to save us once again from the next great existential crisis. You know what? We should have listened to Ron Paul. We should have just gotten rid of the Fed. We should have gotten rid of the Fed when it betrayed the country by making entry into the Great War possible. We should have gotten rid of the Fed when they caused the boom and bust of the late 1920s that led to the 1929 stock market crash. We should have gotten rid of the Fed when it was unable to assist in ending the Great Depression, but rather prolonged it. We should have gotten rid of the Fed when, after World War II and moving into the 1960s, it inspired successive business cycles and inflations, and especially after the 1970s, with the first wave of devastation that came in the form of inflation. And we should have gotten rid of the Fed after its zero interest rate policies after 2009 massively distorted industrial structures, causing big business to get ever bigger and more leveraged up while crushing small business. That's what's happened in this country, thanks mostly to the central bank. And now we have, in our own times, evidence all around us of the devastation that it's caused. Diminishing American purchasing power, once again gutting savings, and redistributing wealth from the poor and the middle class to the rich. And instead of apologizing and embarking on a new system and a new way of doing things, we're just going to do it again. I'm so sorry to report. How much better would it be if we just put freedom first? This is Jeffrey Tucker. Thank you.